welcome back to Sleepless Stories. How are you doing tonight? Ready to slip into something eerie? Before we begin, let me know in the comments, what time are you listening to this? Midnight, 3 a.m., or just trying to survive the evening with a chill down your spine? Now get comfy. Maybe wrap yourself in a blanket, dim the lights, and let the sound of the rain lull you into that perfect place between dreaming and something else. Because tonight's story isn't just meant to entertain, it's meant to stay with you. Let's begin. The library that borrows you back. Epilogue. The book that still remembers. The library is quiet now. Not the comforting hush of pages turning, or the soft whispers of readers trading secrets between the shelves. No, this quiet is vast. It stretches across time, curls into the margins of forgotten books, and lingers in corners where the dust doesn't settle. Where once there was a door, there is only brick. Where once there were librarians, there are only names, carved into the backs of books. No one opens anymore, but somewhere, deep in the belly of the old library, past the shelves that should not be counted, beyond the corridors that loop in on themselves like riddles, there is a table, and on the table a book. It is closed, locked, even, bound in something that might have once been leather, but now pulses faintly, as if remembering how to breathe. Its title is not printed. It's not even visible, not unless you know your own name well enough to say it backwards, in a voice you don't recognize, during the final seconds of sleep. Then and only then does the title appear. The Borrowed, and underneath, still fainter, Author You. Marla is gone, or at least the version of Marla who used to breathe and sweat and bleed. That girl, the one who stumbled into the ancient library looking for something to explain the ache inside her chest. She ended the moment she opened the last book. She didn't remember writing it, but it remembered her. Each word she read stitched her back together, not as she was, but as she had been in all the lives she had forgotten. 12 selves, 1,000 endings. She saw them all, felt them collapse into her like echoes falling back into a canyon. She wasn't special, not in the way people like to think. She had simply remembered what most of us spend our lives trying to forget, that we don't own our stories. They borrow us. There were others, of course, other readers, other borrowers, some left with pages torn from their own timelines, memories they didn't recognize stuffed into the backs of their minds like misplaced dreams. Some never left. They became characters in books still being written, waiting for some poor soul to read their chapter aloud and let them out again. And some were lost, entirely, reduced to ink, footnotes, blotted names on yellowing index cards. You could say Marla was lucky. She left the library with all her memories intact. But that's not quite true. She left with all her memories, yes, but not all of them were hers. Now she writes, not with a pen, not even with keys. She writes in sleep. In the slow shift of dreams, that make no sense until you wake up and find something in your handwriting on the bedside table. She writes in silence, in the way people forget your face when you walk by, then remember it in nightmares they can't quite explain. She writes in you reader, you listener, you who pressed play expecting a bedtime story, and instead found something pressing back. She doesn't blame you. The library calls to everyone eventually. We just don't all hear it at the same volume. Some catch it in the spaces between sentences. Some feel it in old buildings that don't like to be empty. Some only know it as an ache to go somewhere, even if you do know where. She hears it still, but she doesn't return, not because she can't, but because she might stay. And if she stays, the book will begin again. Some doors are meant to close once only, but sometimes at night, in places where time pools strangely. You might see her, a woman with tired eyes and hands, stained with forgotten ink. She might be browsing the shelves of a bookstore that doesn't exist in daylight. She might be walking past you in a library you could have sworn was locked. She might even be standing at the end of your bed, watching you sleep, whispering to the dark, "Don't forget your name." She doesn't want to hurt you. She only wants to remember you, because she read your story once, and the ending wasn't finished. Not yet. Chapter 1, The Librarian's Lantern. Rain slicked the cobblestones as Nina stepped off the last train into a town she didn't remember choosing. Her suitcase creaked behind her, the wheels catching on uneven bricks that looked older than memory. A faint smell of smoke and lavender drifted through the air. She pulled her coat tighter. The sky above was bruised purple, hanging low, pressing against the rooftops, as if trying to smother the place. The station behind her was already dark. She had no plan, no address, not even a clear reason for coming. Only the invitation, a handwritten letter folded once, sealed with red wax, and signed with a name she didn't recognize. Your place is waiting. The hollow remembers. No return address, no date, but something about the script had pulled her. A name that wasn't hers anymore, but still felt familiar. Maybe. She turned the letter over in her pocket again as she walked. Street signs bore names she almost knew. Lamplight Row, Ashen Bell Street, Gloaming Way. They felt like dream fragments, half remembered, half invented. The rain never got heavier. It just whispered down like it was trying to keep the town asleep. Nina walked until she saw it. The library, a towering, lopsided building tucked between two narrow alleys, barely lit from within. The windows glowed with warm amber light. Carved above the double doors were the words, Gloaming Hollow Memorial Library. She didn't remember this town, but she remembered those doors. Inside, it was warm, dusty, but not in a neglected way, more like the books had simply been breathing a long time. Wooden shelves curved impossibly upward, vanishing into shadows high above. Spiral staircases disappeared into domes of books. Somewhere, A record player hummed a tune she couldn't quite name, and there was a woman waiting for her at the front desk. She wore a black dress with buttons like polished bone. Her hair was silver, but her eyes young, and in her hand she held a lantern. "You're late," the woman said. Nina blinked. "I don't know what I'm here for." "That's all right, you will." The woman turned the lantern toward her. The light inside wasn't flame, nor was it electric. It pulsed like breath, soft, pale, and rhythmic. It cast no shadows. Nina stepped closer without meaning to. "Who are you?" "The keeper," the woman said, as if it explained everything. Of memories, of names, of stories waiting to be remembered. She handed Nina the lantern. "You're not here to borrow books," she said. "You're here to find yourself." The lantern changed everything. When Nina held it, the books whispered. Not in any language she recognized, but in impressions, flashes of faces, tears, laughter echoing down corridors, storms that never made landfall. Some books were locked. Some burned at her touch. Some wept. She stayed in the attic, a room just beneath the roof, filled with antique furniture and walls of rain-stained journals. The bed was carved with runes. The window never opened, but sometimes she saw eyes behind the glass. And every morning, there was a new note beside the lantern. "Shelve the forgotten. Speak only when spoken to. Do not follow the fog." It was on the fourth night that she met the boy with no mouth. He sat in the reading room, staring at a book that had no title. His skin was gray, eyes too wide, and where his lips should be was smooth flesh. Nina didn't mean to speak, but the lantern flared in her hand, and she heard herself say, "What are you reading?" He looked up and whispered into her head, "Your story." Then the book opened itself. Inside were pages that bled ink. Her name in looping cursive, scratched out and rewritten. Dates she didn't remember living. A diagram of a house that looked familiar, her grandmother's, maybe, but with an extra staircase, one that led to a black void. The boy closed the book, then stood and walked backward into the shadows, literally backward, like time revering. She didn't follow. She shelved the book. Sometimes the library shifted. Whole wings would vanish overnight. New staircases appeared. One hallway led into a mirror. Another into the same room you just left, but different books in new places. Clocks ticking backward, your reflection older. The keeper never answered questions. "Don't trust everything you remember," she told Nina. "Memory is just a vote, not the truth." On the 12th day, Nina found a corridor filled with doors. Each door had a name. Some were names she'd answered to before: Cora, Elena, Myra. One just said daughter. Another, she who waited. And one was scratched out entirely. She opened the one that bore her current name, Nina. Inside was a room made of salt, walls of compacted white, a bed shaped like a coffin, and on the wall, a photograph of her taken in the train station she arrived from. except her face was turned. She was smiling at someone just out of frame. There was no one else in the room. She closed the door. That night, she dreamed of fog pouring through the cracks in the library. It didn't move like weather. It crept, clawed, curled up around books, and suffocated them. She saw the keeper, arms outstretched, holding it back with sheer will. The boy with no mouth stood beside her, screaming silently. And Nina, she held the lantern, but it was flickering. The fog whispered her name in voices that weren't hers. Then she woke to real fog pressing against the attic window and a new note beside the lantern. You are being remembered. Downstairs, the library had changed again. Shelves were rearranged to form a spiral. At the center stood a book bound in skin. Her name was etched into the cover, but not Nina. The other name, the older one, the one she hadn't dared speak. She didn't open it. Instead, she turned to the keeper, who watched from the upper banister. Am I a ghost? Nina asked. The keeper smiled. Worse, you're a memory, a strong one, the kind that gets trapped. Then why am I here? Because someone remembered you wrong. The lantern pulsed, and from outside, the bell tower rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Fog slipped in through the cracks in the door, and the library exhaled. Chapter 2. The Lantern Echoes. The next morning, the air in the village felt tighter. Not colder, but denser, as though each breath the villagers took had to be pulled through wet cloth. Smoke rose from the chimneys, curling in ways that defied wind, and the birds' songs were strangely absent. Silence had weight here now, and it settled over the rooftops like fog. Amara awoke with the lantern beside her bed, exactly where she hadn't left it. Her first instinct was to believe she'd misremembered. Maybe she had brought it inside the night before and simply forgotten. Maybe the bizarre vision had only been a waking dream, some half-sleep hallucination brewed from exhaustion and the eerie calm of the midnight hour. That was easier to accept than the idea that the lantern had returned on its own. Easier to digest than the memory of her own voice, younger and fractured, calling to her through the fog. Still, she didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, she dressed slowly, pulled her shawl tight, and stepped out into the cobblestone lane. The bakery door across the street hung open on its hinge, though the closed sign still swung from the frame. Windows once adorned with lace curtains were now bare, glass smeared with a thin, gray film. No children played. No shopkeepers greeted her. The village seemed hollowed out, like something vital had been drained in the night. She wasn't the only one who noticed. At the edge of the village green, just past the forgotten well that hadn't drawn water in 3 summers, stood a group of elders. They murmured among themselves, with glances cast toward the sky, toward the library, and toward Amara, especially toward Amara. She approached slowly. One of them, a hunched man, with a cane made of twisted hawthorn, raised his chin as she neared. It came back, didn't it? He asked. Amara stopped. The lantern. Another elder A thin woman with a veil that barely masked her clouded eyes nodded. They always return to the ones who listen. Amara swallowed. What is it? Why is it here? The hawthorn cane tapped the earth. It's not here for you. It's here through you. That's worse. Cryptic riddles, half-truths. The same games the old ones always played. But this time, Amara couldn't afford patience. Tell me what it is, or tell me what happened to the village. A long pause. The veil woman lifted her face to the sky, where clouds churned like oil on water. The librarian has awoken. Amara felt her heart lurch in her chest. She remembered the name from old stories told in whispers, never written, never taught. A figure spoken of when the winds howled wrong, when ink ran strange on the page. The librarian who walked the space between knowledge and madness. The keeper of stories unwritten and memories unremembered. A myth, a threat used to frighten wandering children. That's not real, Amara said, quieter than she meant to. The hawthorn man shook his head. Nothing in this village ever was. Not really. You just stopped questioning the shape of it. That's what he needs. Doubtless minds. Predictable lives. Amara backed away. She couldn't breathe here. The air was too still, too full. The library. She turned and ran. The library door creaked on its own before she reached it. Inside, the air felt wrong. Books no longer sat quietly on their shelves. Pages fluttered despite the lack of wind. The dust no longer settled, but hung suspended in the air like ash. And on the central table sat the lantern, but not her lantern. It was the same shape, the same copper frame and green-tinted glass. But this one glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Beside it sat an open book she had never catalogued. Its pages were filled with handwriting that shifted when she looked directly at it, morphing from cursive to symbols, to sketches of eyes that blinked when unobserved. Amara reached for it. Don't. A voice. She spun. In the far alcove, behind the poetry shelf, stood a woman, or the outline of one. Her form shimmered like heat above stone. She wore a dress made of parchment, her eyes inky voids. Her hair floated around her like tendrils in water. Amara found her voice. Who are you? You already know. You've read me before. Amara shook her head. That makes no sense. The figure stepped forward, and the room dimmed with her movement. Neither does the world you live in. Not now. Not anymore. The librarian's lantern has been lit. That light will find every lie you ever believed, every page you thought was closed. Amara pointed to the lantern, then put it out. The figure smiled, or at least bent where a smile might be. You lit it, only you can unlight it. But the price is high. Amara narrowed her eyes. What price? Your certainty, your name, your past, the story of who you think you are. The book on the table fluttered. Pages turned by invisible hands. It stopped at a chapter titled Amara, the Remembered. Below the title, a photo of her. A child holding a broken quill. eyes wide, with something too large for her age. "I didn't give anyone that picture," she whispered. The figure tilted its head. "You gave everything. You just don't recall." Then the walls of the library stretched. Shelves grew taller, higher than the building should allow. A distant bell tolled from the spiral stairwell that hadn't existed yesterday. "The librarian is waiting," the figure said, and vanished into motes of dust. Amara climbed. Each stair brought voices, whispered memories, some hers, some not. A girl asking where her mother went. A boy sobbing over torn pages. A woman screaming names that turned into static. At the top, a door with no knob. Only her hand made it open. The chamber beyond was circular, lined with shelves that held not books, but jars. Each one glowed faintly, filled with swirling ink. As she approached, she saw that each jar was labeled. One read, "Amara, first lie." Another, "Amara, what you forgot." Another, "Not your memory." A desk sat at the center, and behind it, writing with a pen made of bone, was the librarian. He didn't look up. "You were meant to stay asleep." Amara stepped forward. "I woke up." "That's inconvenient." She scanned the jars. "What are these?" He finally looked up. His eyes were white, blank, endless. "They are the ink of your story. The parts you traded, the names you wore, the truths you rejected." Amara stepped closer. "Then I want them back." The librarian smiled. "No, you don't." The door behind her vanished. The shelves began to close in. The jars rattled. He held up the lantern. "Blow it out, and everything goes back. You forget. They forget. The story sleeps again." Amara looked at the flame, then back at the jars. "No, I want to know who I am. All of it." The librarian frowned. "Then read." And with that, the shelves burst open. Ink flowed like rivers, and the lantern flared. Chapter 3, The Lost Ink. When the ink came, it did not stain the floor. It slithered, crawled, climbed. Black streams like roots of thought, bleeding from broken jars and ancient bindings, writhing across the chamber like snakes hunting a heartbeat. Amara stood frozen, the lantern now blazing on the librarian's desk, casting long, twitching shadows that danced like memories just out of reach. Each flicker illuminated fragments of stories that had been sealed, shredded, or suppressed. Not just hers. Everyone. The shelves groaned under the weight of the unraveling past. Amara backed against the wall, her fingers brushing a jar that pulsed with a dull amber glow. She turned it in her hand. Label, the thing you named your brother. She didn't have a brother. Or had she? The ink inside churned violently as if sensing doubt. "Every memory you disowned," said the librarian calmly, still seated, unmoved by the chaos. "Every lie you told yourself to survive. They demand to be reread." Amara felt something slither around her ankle. The ink was climbing her. It wasn't cold. It was warm like blood. She pulled her foot back and stumbled into another jar, which cracked but didn't shatter. Ink hissed out like gas, swirling into words in the air. You cried when you watched her drown. Who, her mother, her friend? The name wouldn't come. The ink didn't care. It only remembered. The librarian stood now, his robe unfurled like paper caught in wind, etched with script so old it bent the lines of sight. He walked toward her without touching the floor. His feet hovered inches above, leaving no trace, like the forgotten. You want the truth. You must wear it. You must be it. She raised the lantern between them. Then let me read. The ink reared like a wave, ready to crash. But the light flared with a low, resonant hum, a vibration that pulled the ink back. For a moment, the chamber stood still. The librarian's eyes narrowed. You're not ready. No one ever is. The ink formed a doorway. Not a door. Just the shape of one, an outline etched in oozing black, framing a corridor made of shifting, liquid memory. Amara stepped through. The corridor changed as she walked. One moment, it was her grandmother's hallway, the yellow wallpaper peeling, the smell of boiled tea leaves steeped in age. Then it became the alley behind the bakery where she'd scraped her knee at 7. Then a place she didn't recognize at all. A hospital corridor drenched in flickering red light. Voices echoed, but they weren't hers. She's not responding to the medication. It's the trauma. We can only manage symptoms now. She ran. The next room was circular, with walls covered in mirrors like the chamber from the old tale of the false names. Each mirror showed her at a different age, in different attire, with expressions she barely recognized. In one, she was a librarian herself, dust on her shoulders and a dagger in her hand. In another, she wore a crown of thorns, her eyes entirely black, but only one mirror drew her in, the one that showed her sitting quietly, reading the exact book she was now living. She placed a hand on the glass. Her reflection blinked. The glass did not. The mirror warped into liquid and pulled her through. She fell, or rose, or something in between. The ink swirled around her like a cocoon, whispering in dead languages, humming lullabies only grief understands. Through the haze, she heard the librarian again. Truth is not given, it is survived. She emerged in a room of silence. Not quiet silence, no echoes, no breath, just the hum of nothing. Before her, a table, a quill, a single page of paper, and beside it, a nameplate. It read Amara, final draft. The ink pooled beside the paper. She knew what she had to do. She dipped the quill. She wrote, not just her name, not just her story, but the pieces she had denied, the emotions she had swallowed, the horrors she had dreamt of, and the kindnesses she thought herself unworthy of. With each stroke of the quill, the ink inside her bled onto the page. The librarian watched from nowhere. When the final word was written, the ink began to evaporate. The paper glowed. The lantern dimmed. And Amara stood, no longer uncertain. She was written. She was read. She was real. Chapter 4. The Archivist's Wake. The day after the ink burst from the librarian's chamber, the village changed. Not visibly. The houses remained intact. The cobblestones still whispered underfoot. The bakery window still displayed its crusted loaves that no one touched. But something beneath the skin of the world shifted. The silence thickened. The reflections in windows began to delay, as if reality were buffering behind the glass. Footsteps echoed longer than they should have. Time pulled at itself, just slightly off-tempo. Amara had fled the library only when the ink began to sink into her shoes, pulling at her like tar. The librarian hadn't followed, but his voice did, echoing down the stairwell long after she had passed the threshold. Words she couldn't remember, but still felt smeared across her mind. She hadn't slept. Not properly. Each time her eyes fluttered closed, she felt like she was sinking beneath a layer of liquid parchment, trapped between words that squirmed when read. Her dreams bled over into waking. The shape of her shadow changed depending on what she remembered last. But she wasn't alone anymore. The woman in parchment, the ink-eyed ghost, she appeared each night now, not as an invader, but like a regular presence. Sitting at Amara's table, running a finger across her shelves, humming old lullabies in languages Amara didn't speak but understood in her chest. "Why me?" Amara asked one night. The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she held up a small glass vial filled with black ink. Inside, something moved. Because your story doesn't want to be forgotten. It claws its way back into the ink. Even the librarian couldn't bottle all of you. Amara reached for the vial. Her fingers passed through it. "What do I do now?" she whispered. The woman pointed outside, toward the woods, toward the place where the road ended. "You find the archivist." They said no one ever returned from the road beyond the woods. It wasn't because of monsters or beasts or death. It was something far worse. They forgot to come back. The path was still marked by mossy stones and crooked signposts. One pointed toward the coast, though the sea hadn't been seen in generations. Another pointed straight up, labeled dreams. Amara ignored them and stepped between the trees. The woods whispered, not in voices, but in ideas. She caught flashes of other lives that might have been hers. A version of herself living in a city made of shelves. Another with ink-stained lips, reciting poetry to mirrors. A child's voice screamed for help, and when she turned, it was her own face in the clearing, younger, terrified, being dragged into the bark of a tree that had eyes. She kept walking. After what could have been hours or weeks, the trees thinned, and she found the gate. It wasn't grand, just 2 iron bars stuck into the earth, with a piece of parchment nailed between them. "Here sleeps the archivist. Do not wake." Amara stepped through. The ground here felt wrong. Not like dirt, not like stone. It had give to it, like pages stacked underfoot. And the sky above was a parchment dome, painted with stars that blinked occasionally. buildings stood in half form, part real, part drawn. She passed a tower made of grammar, a well of unwritten endings, and a tree whose bark was riddled with footnotes. At the center stood a cathedral of ink. It pulsed like a heart. Inside, the air smelled like forgotten names. And at the altar, bound by ribbons of sentence fragments and sealed with metaphors, lay the archivist. He looked almost human, except his chest was hollow. And inside it floated quills, dozens, all writing on scrolls that weren't attached to anything. His eyes were sealed with wax. His mouth had no lips, just a seam of script. Amara stepped forward. The cathedral shook. The ghost woman appeared beside her again. Just a flicker now. You don't wake him with sound, she said. You wake him with truth. Amara closed her eyes. She remembered the bakery's warmth when she was small. She remembered her mother's voice, telling stories that never ended the same way twice. She remembered the first time she touched a book and felt it breathe. She spoke these aloud, and the wax on the archivist's eyes cracked. She remembered the day the village fell silent, the way the librarian's door opened without her touching it, the way the lantern always found its way back, the seam of script on the archivist's mouth unstitched. She remembered Cora. She remembered Elias. She remembered herself not as one, but many fractured, rewritten, rearranged. And with that, the quills stopped. One by one, they floated into his chest and vanished. The archivist sat up. He looked at Amara with eyes that saw too many layers. You've come to reclaim yourself, he said, voice like turning pages. Amara nodded, and to stop the librarian, the archivist tilted his head. You can't stop a concept, but you can revise it. He held out a book, bound in ash and stitched in red thread. This is the record of your story. All drafts, all edits, all truths. It has no title yet. Amara reached for it. It felt like home. It felt like fire. What do I do with it? The archivist stood. The cathedral around them began to dissolve into ink. You write your ending. When she stepped out of the woods, the village was gone. Not destroyed, gone. In its place was an empty field. The cobblestones were still faintly visible, like pressed flowers in a book. But the buildings, the signs, the people vanished. The wind carried whispers of what had been. She opened the book. Blank. She picked up the quill the archivist had given her, dipped it in her own blood, just a drop, and she began to write. Not a return, not a resurrection, but a revision, one where the librarian's lantern stayed unlit, one where stories were chosen, not forced, one where names were remembered and selves stayed whole. Each word she wrote reshaped the air. The bakery door creaked back into being. A window glowed. Footsteps began to echo again. The birds returned, their song hesitant but growing bolder. The village rebuilt itself. Not the same, never the same, but real. And Amara, for the first time, knew who she was. Not a ghost, not an echo, not a forgotten draft. But the author, the lantern, never returned. She didn't need it anymore. She had the ink, and this time the story was hers. Chapter 5, Ink and Ash. The air beyond the rewritten village was thinner, not in breath, but in meaning. Amara, now writer and written, stepped through the edge of reality, where the bakery's chimney faded into blank parchment sky, her fingers still inked from the night before. The book at her side no longer fluttered or shifted. It pulsed, warm as a heartbeat, heavy with the gravity of self-authorship. But there was a tremor in the ink. She noticed it first in the syntax of sound. Footsteps, no longer aligned with her pace, wind bending around nouns instead of trees. Every breath she took felt like a paragraph break. The world had not rejected her revisions, but it had not wholly accepted them either. There were seams now, sutures in the shape of ellipses, and untitled footnotes stitched into the corners of sky and soil. And in those seams, something stirred. She returned to the library, or rather, what had returned of it. The building was half ghost, half ink blot, its roof perpetually erasing itself and redrawing anew. Inside, books whispered with tentative voices, unsure of their own plots. One shelf spoke entirely in conditional tense. Another had teeth. She made her way to the librarian's former chamber, but the stairwell no longer existed. In its place was a spiral of floating glyphs, each one humming with forgotten phonemes. She stepped into the void and let herself be carried upward. At the top, a mirror, but not one that reflected. It recorded. Her image shimmered, cycling through drafts of herself: child, elder, villain, ghost, author. Faces she might have been flickered like pages caught in a storm. "You rewrote the village," said a voice behind her. Familiar and threadbare. She turned. The woman of parchment had changed. Her form was solid now, her eyes no longer pools of ink, but mirrors of Amara's own. She wore flesh the way one might wear a well-read coat, creased, marked, real. "I thought you were gone. You thought I was never real. That's the same thing." Amara stepped closer. "Who were you?" The woman smiled. "I was your first unwritten truth, the one you hid to make the story simpler. I waited in the margins until you were ready to read me." Amara reached out. Their hands touched. The ink between them burned, but didn't scar. "The librarian isn't gone," the woman whispered. "He's been edited, but not ended. He waits where all first drafts go to be forgotten." Amara closed her eyes. She saw it then, a place beneath memory and meaning, a pit filled with discarded selves and half-named fears. She had felt it before, in dreams and dust. The place the villagers called the Hollow Spine. She would have to go back. The entrance to the Hollow Spine lay beneath the well. It had always been there, cleverly hidden beneath the idea of disuse. No water had been drawn in years, not because the source had dried, but because the rope had always frayed before reaching the bottom. Amara climbed down, deeper than the stone walls suggested, until the light from above became a footnote in the dark. The tunnel below was not made of earth, but of erased words, sentences hung like cobwebs. Forgotten metaphors crawled along the floor, and deeper still, paragraphs once whispered in childhood bled from the walls, begging to be remembered. At the end, the librarian, not sitting now, standing. He no longer wore the face of authority. His features shifted, flickering between scholar and beast, teacher and tyrant. He was a concept unraveled, a plot whole made sentient. "You rewrote," he said, voice like cracking vellum. "You dared." Amara held up her book. It glowed softly, real in a way he now was not. "I remembered." The librarian lunged, but not with body, with doubt. A wave of unspoken fears crashed against her. What if the villagers didn't return because they were never real? What if the stories she reclaimed were lies more dangerous than forgetfulness? What if she too was fiction, written by someone else in a deeper ink? She bent but didn't break. Her story flared, pages flying open. Every truth she had reclaimed poured out, forming a circle of narrative around her. The ink on the floor hissed, recoiling. The librarian screamed not in pain, but in loss. His shape collapsed inward, folding into a footnote. Then a footnote into a phrase into a single, forgotten word. He was gone. Amara rose. The hollow spine breathed once, then fell silent. As she climbed back into the village, dawn painted the sky not with light, but with language. Every beam of sun was a stanza, every shadow a subtext. The villagers waited, not all, but enough. Those whose stories had the will to return. They blinked awake from the fog, eyes wide with authorship. And when Amara stepped back into the square, they bowed, not in reverence, but in recognition. They too were writing now. The village would change again, not because of curses, not because of lanterns, but because stories, when remembered, remember back. And there were many more to tell. Chapter 6, The Quiet Revisions. There was no sunrise anymore. Amara noticed it 3 mornings after she rewrote the village into being. The sky lightened, yes, and shadows softened. But the sun itself never broke the horizon. It remained a bright suggestion beyond the clouds, a presence that only implied warmth. She would wake, stretch, breathe the ink-tinged air, and stare toward the east where morning should begin, only to find the same flat glow diffusing across the parchment-colored sky. It was enough to read by, enough to walk by, but it wasn't real. And maybe that was the point. Each day, she wandered the newly resurrected streets, watching the homes settle into place like books aligning on a shelf. They looked like the old village, mostly same shuttered windows, same crooked chimneys, but there were differences if you stared too long. The bakery was back, but its sign read loaves and echoes instead of Mara's oven. The well at the square whispered now when no one was near, and the library had not returned at all. Instead, there was a blank space where it should be, like a paragraph redacted from the world. emerged slowly, silhouettes stepping from doorways that hadn't existed a week before. They moved with cautious familiarity, nodding to Amara as if she'd always been there. But none of them were names she remembered. There was no Cora, no Elias, no whisper of the ghost woman or the archivist. Just neighbors whose names shifted each time she asked, their voices muffled by the thinness of their reality. They knew her, or thought they did. She smiled and nodded and tried not to let her loneliness bend her spine. At night, the wind brought stories, not from books, not written down, but carried on the air like rumors between the trees. Amara would lie in bed, the ink-bound journal open beside her, and listen to Taylor's murmur across her window panes. A child swallowed by her reflection, a man whose name unraveled while he slept, a candle that burned cold and melted stone. She didn't know if the stories were hers, or if the village itself was dreaming them up in response to her presence. Maybe it didn't matter. They needed someone to record them, and she had the ink. But the ink had started to change. At first, it had been obedient. Whatever she wrote in the book came true in the village, the way a reader turns pages and believes without question. A fountain here, a path restored, even small comforts, hot tea that never cooled, rain that washed but didn't soak. But now, as she dipped the archivist's quill into the bottle, she noticed streaks of gray threading through the black. The ink resisted sometimes. She would write a line, only to find a different one scrawled across the page in her own handwriting. One morning, she opened the book to find a passage she had never written. The author wakes, but the dream continues. She tore out the page. That night, her dreams bled sideways. She walked through the village as it flickered between drafts, rooftops changing styles, streets realigning under her feet. Voices called her name from behind shutters, but each one spoke in a different tone. Some were scared, some mocking. One was her own, weeping. She passed the square and found the statue there had morphed. It was of her now, holding a quill, one hand raised, mouth sewn shut. She woke gasping. The book lay open beside her. The ink had moved on its own, dripping symbols across her bedsheets, like spilled language. The next day, the reflections began to speak. At first it was soft, just a word or two when she brushed her teeth or passed a window. They whispered warnings: don't reread, stay on the current page, close the book. But then they grew bolder. Her reflection in the bakery door reached toward her. The puddle in the square shimmered with a version of herself that shook its head slowly whenever she got too close. It wasn't just her story anymore. The village was writing back. She went to the edge of the woods, journal clutched in one hand. The trees loomed unchanged, the sky above them bending at strange angles like a poorly rendered painting. She didn't enter. Not yet. Instead, she opened the book and flipped through the pages she'd filled since returning. Each one pulsed faintly, the ink warm to the touch. But interspersed among her paragraphs were other entries, like footnotes that grew bolder by the day. She doesn't remember the first draft. Ink lies when unattended. The librarian still turns pages. The last line was underlined in red. She closed the book. In the the center of town, the blank space where the library had once stood began to ripple. It didn't build itself back, no, it unfolded, like a pop-up from a forbidden text. Walls rose, transparent and wavering, filled with silhouettes of books that hadn't yet been read. The door returned last, and this time it was open. Inside, the air reeked of memory. Amara stepped over the threshold and found the shelves rearranged. They bent upward now, spiraling into impossible arches. Pages rustled without wind. Lanterns floated, flickering with ink instead of flame. At the center stood a desk she didn't recognize, circular, made of bound volumes stitched together. Behind it sat a figure, not the librarian, not entirely. He had the same hollowed eyes, the same lantern swaying from a chain around his wrist. But his body flickered, parts of it drawn in pencil, others inked too darkly. He looked like someone copying the librarian without understanding him fully. "Amara," he said, voice like scraped vellum. "You're not him." "No, but I remember him. As you do, we are drafts. You are just further along." She stepped closer. "Why is the ink resisting me?" "Because you're not editing anymore. You're being edited." The statement stole the warmth from her chest. By who? He didn't answer. Instead, he held out a page. Blank, except for one line in the center. "Who authored the first version of you?" Amara turned away. She fled the library, the village, the streets that twisted in their sleep. She returned to her home, locked the door, and placed the journal on the hearth. The fire didn't catch at first. The book pulsed, fighting, as if the ink within had claws. But it burned. Pages curled. Letters screamed silently. Words that had no mouth begged for another sentence. She sat and watched until all that remained was ash. And then she opened her hand. Inside was the vial. The one the ghost woman had shown her. The one with something moving inside. The ink, still hers, still alive. Not everything could be rewritten. But maybe some things could be reborn. She stepped outside into the half-light. This time, when she looked toward the east, the sun wasn't there. But something was. It looked back. Chapter 7, The Names That Sleep. Amara walked among the reconstructed village like a stranger in her own bones. The bakery smelled once more of warm crust and sweet yeast. The windows no longer delayed her reflection. But nothing was the same. Everything had returned slightly askew. The cobblestones curved differently beneath her steps. The signs bore her name in flourished scripts that faded if stared at too long. The people, they were back, but they weren't the same. Their faces were ones she recognized, but their eyes held different stories. Each person called her by a different name. To the baker, she was Elen. To the apothecary, Myra. To the girl who swept leaves from doorways, she was someone called Aya. Amara tried correcting them at first, but the moment she insisted, their expressions would blanken, a veil falling over their memory, and the name would return the next day, unchanged. The book, the one bound in ash and stitched with red, remained with pages slowly filling with ink, not from her hand. Each morning, new entries appeared, stories of her wandering into the woods again, finding glass cities that dissolved upon entry, singing to statues that bled ink tears, speaking to herself in mirrors where her reflection aged while she remained unchanged. The more she read, the more she felt her own identity stretch. The more she resisted, the more the names multiplied. She found herself writing things she didn't remember experiencing, then finding evidence that she had. A scarf she didn't own hung by the door. A diary entry in her handwriting, dated 2 weeks ahead. Her own voice whispered to her at night, reading from the book beside her bed. The archivist had warned her. Revising a story meant becoming the author, and sometimes the author is many people. She walked to the edge of the village that night, past the bakery, beyond the square, to the place where the ink first burst. The library remained sealed. But now, strange flowers grew from the cracks between its stones, flowers shaped like ears, listening. They swayed gently without wind, petals pulsing with silent breath. She sat before the door. "I want to understand," she whispered. The door did not open, but something passed beneath it, a single card, old and yellowed, curling at the edges. It read, "Names sleep when unspoken. Wake them carefully." The next morning, she returned to the bakery. "Do you remember my name today?" she asked the baker. He paused, blinked, then smiled. "Hélène, of course. Always have. What if I told you it was?" His brow furrowed. He rubbed flour into his hands nervously. "It wouldn't matter, would it? The name I know is the name you wear. Anything else is a dream I forgot." Amara nodded slowly and stepped out. As the days passed, she began to write the names she heard. Dozens. Each time she heard a new one, she etched it into the ash-bound book. And with each name, a memory returned, not always hers, but familiar. She remembered being Elia's, feeling weight in her limbs as the lantern flickered above. She remembered being Cora, scribbling warnings in margins and crying into her teacup. She remembered being Nina, only that name felt closest, like it was the spine from which the others branched. One night, she followed the flowers from the library. They had grown into a trail, curling like ink tendrils into the forest, deeper than the path she once walked. She followed them. The trees welcomed her like a cathedral, tall, quiet, filled with breathless awe. The petals glowed faintly now, revealing handprints on trunks and footsteps that pulsed like heat prints in soil. She came to a clearing. It was a circle of mirrors, all cracked but upright. Each one reflected a different version of her. Not distorted, not monstrous, just slightly off. Different smiles, different scars. One wore glasses. One had no eyes. One had hands covered in ink, nails sharpened like quills. She stepped forward, toward the mirror that reflected her as Nina. The others whispered, "Who do you think you are?" Amara touched the glass. It rippled. "I'm all of you." But I remember being her first. The mirrors pulsed. one by one, then shattered not explosively, but as if sighing apart. In their place stood 12 books, stacked around her in a circle. Each bore a name from her book: Elia's, Cora, Myra, Elen, Aya, and others names she hadn't written but somehow knew. She picked one at random, opened it, and read a life. Not a story, not a fiction, a full life from breath to breath. She wept for all of them, for all the versions that were written, erased, buried beneath ink and memory, for the selves lost in footnotes, for the chapters that ended mid-sentence. And then she stood, carried all 12 books in her arms, and walked back to the village, not to rewrite them, but to remember them. That night, she placed each book in a different home. She left Elia's book at the watchtower, Cora's in the apothecary, Aya's beside the well. One by one, she returned the names to places that felt true, and the people changed, not dramatically, but they began to speak differently, to remember fragments, to glance at her and say, "You feel familiar, like a dream I used to have." Amara smiled, not correcting them anymore, letting the names sleep, letting them wake, for she was the author, and this time her story had room for all of them. Chapter 8, The Weight of Remembering. The village breathed again, but each exhale brought a new layer of unease. Though the people smiled and laughed and wandered their reconstructed lives, Amara saw the static between their gestures. Like a painting held too close to fire, the edges of the world flickered in and out of shape. Conversations looped when she walked too fast. Windows blinked if she stared too long. And above all, the flowers from the library continued to grow more now, spiraling through streets, crawling across rooftops, blooming in strange shapes. Ears, mouths, eyes. She stopped sleeping, not because of fear, not because of some imposed insomnia, but because sleep became impossible. Each time she drifted off, she'd find herself in a different version of the village, one where time had slipped sideways and the people whispered in fonts instead of voices. Each dream was a story draft, and she was always the main character, but never quite herself. The book kept growing. Pages turned themselves. Names wrote themselves in ink that shifted between crimson and black. Symbols appeared in the margins, sigils, perhaps, or punctuation marks that bit their own tails. The longer Amara watched the book, the more she could hear it, rustling like paper dragged across a gravel floor, a whisper of vowels never spoken aloud. One night, as she sat beside the fountain, its water now trickling backward, she saw a child approach. She hadn't seen children in weeks, maybe longer. The girl held a mask in her hands, shaped like Amara's own face. "Did you forget again?" the girl asked. Amara opened her mouth, then closed it. "Forget what?" The girl shrugged. "That you're not the only one dreaming." She placed the mask on the fountain's edge and skipped away, vanishing into shadow. Amara picked it up. It was made of vellum, ink bled from the eyes. She followed the trail of flowers again, deeper, this time, beyond the mirrors, beyond the circle of names, past even the place where the trees grew footnotes in their bark. This path led to a valley of silence. Not quiet silence. Here, the air did not move. The stars above were frozen mid-glimmer. Time had left the valley behind like an abandoned bookmark. At the center, on a mound shaped like a heart turned to stone, stood a monument. It was a pillar of books. Thousands, all open to the middle page. Their spines bent backward, their pages held apart by hands of bone and ink. The pillar whispered. Each book was a forgotten life. Not just hers, not just Elia's or Cora or Aya, but names she never knew. Names lost to unspoken drafts, to edits erased before the ink dried. Stories burned, stories redacted, stories never written. A wind stirred just once, and in it she heard, "They remember you." Her fingers trembled. She stepped forward and pressed the ash-bound book to the base of the monument. "Let me carry you," she said. "Let me remember." The books shuddered. One by one, they closed. When she returned to the village, the people had changed again. Their eyes no longer slid past her. They saw her, and behind their gazes, a recognition bloomed. The baker handed her a loaf without asking her name. The apothecary gave her a vial marked for the ache behind your eyes. The girl sweeping leaves called her story sister. They remembered her without needing to. She began writing again, not in the ash-bound book, but in new journals. She placed them in hidden corners of the village. Notebooks beneath floorboards. Pages rolled into bottles and cast into wells. Scraps tied to birds' legs. Letters buried under cobblestones. Each story was a memory she had chosen to preserve, and the village began to respond. Streets shifted to match what she wrote. The bakery's warmth deepened. The fountain flowed forward again. The library's flowers curled inward, becoming buds instead of orifices. She had not rewritten the village. She had remembered it into being. And in doing so, she remembered herself more fully. Not just Nina, not just Amara, but every name, every life, every draft. Some nights, she sat in the cathedral of ink beside the archivist, who said little now. He only handed her quills. "They're not all yours," he said once. "I know, but they trust me to hold them." For how long? She looked at the ash-bound book, heavier than ever. As long as I have pages. The ink never ran out. And the names, they no longer slept. They sang. Chapter 9, The Whispering Walls. The night had thickened into a fog so dense that the streetlights were swallowed whole, their halos lost in the damp gray haze. Amara stood alone in the corridor of her apartment building, the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath her feet, drowned by the whispering walls. It was as if the very plaster and paint breathed with voices, not her own words, that curled and slipped through the cracks. Murmurs from somewhere deep inside the building's bones. The air was heavy, with the scent of damp earth and old ink, the smell settling into her lungs and sinking into her thoughts. The apartment above the one that shouldn't exist was no longer just a mystery locked in wood and silence. It was alive, breathing, watching. Amara tried to focus, but the voices twisted around her, echoing phrases she almost recognized, but not quite. Names, fractured sentences, warnings, and half-remembered confessions. The air thickened and pulsed as if the building itself were a living labyrinth of memories, each corridor folding into another, each door a secret waiting to be unhinged. She walked forward, hesitant, each step a question. She reached her door, Unit 5B, but something was wrong. The paint was peeling in new places, the doorframe bent unnaturally, shadows pooling in the cracks like spilled ink. When she placed her hand on the door, it pulsed with cold life, vibrating as though the wall itself had a heartbeat. The whispers turned into a sigh that brushed past her ear, close enough to feel like breath. The door creaked open before she could turn the knob. Inside, the apartment was empty, but not empty. The air shimmered with an unseen presence. Faint footsteps echoed behind her, and when she spun around, there was nothing but the dim glow of streetlights filtering through the cracked window blinds. Her reflection in the mirror was fragmented. It blinked out at her for a moment before reappearing. But the eyes weren't hers. The furniture shifted subtly, a chair rocking back and forth as if disturbed moments before. On the floor, a scattering of ash traced a shape, an incomplete circle, broken on one side like a wound. The book she'd come to rely on lay open on the table, pages fluttering though there was no breeze. Words in a script she didn't recognize appeared and vanished like ghosts. They watched from the spaces between the walls. A cold draft brushed past her neck. The whispers grew louder, shaping themselves into syllables. Remember, the single word wrapped around her mind like a thread, tugging at memories she hadn't yet reclaimed. Names whispered, overlapping, pressing against the edges of her sanity. Elia's, Cora, Nina. The names that had become more than just echoes. They were fractures of her own soul, splintered across timelines and shadows. She closed the book, but the voices seeped in through the seams of the room, climbing the walls, creeping beneath the floorboards. The apartment itself was a prism, refracting her fractured identity into 1,000 pieces, each reflection warped by fear and longing. Amara's breath hitched. She moved toward the small kitchen, where a flickering light above cast trembling shadows. The sink dripped with slow, measured rhythm. Each drop was a pulse, like the heartbeat of the building. And as the sound repeated, the walls seemed to pulse in response. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement, a shadow coalescing into a figure. A woman, pale, her eyes hollow and deep as wells. Her lips moved, but the words dissolved before Amara could hear them. "Who are you?" Amara demanded, voice barely above a whisper. The woman raised a hand, long, thin fingers trembling like twigs in a windless storm. The figure pointed behind Amara, toward the narrow hallway leading to the bedrooms. Slowly, Amara turned. The hallway stretched impossibly far, walls curving and bending like the inside of a seashell. Doors appeared and vanished along the length, some marked with symbols that writhed as she looked. The shadows pooled deeper there, beckoning her forward. Against her better judgment, she stepped in. The whispering grew louder, a chorus now, chanting names and memories that didn't belong to her, but did. A door slid open at the end of the hall. Beyond it, a dimly lit room with a single window overlooking the city's restless lights. Inside, scattered on the floor, were dozens of photographs. Faces blurred, eyes scratched out or replaced with ink blots. Among them, she saw familiar ones, hers, Elia's, Cora's, only twisted, fractured. On the wall, words scrawled in hurried script. To remember is to rewrite. To forget is to die. Her fingers trembled as she reached to touch one of the photos. The image rippled beneath her skin, pulling her in. Suddenly, she was there, standing in a crowded room filled with strangers, whose faces flickered between clarity and shadow. The air was thick with tension and unspoken truths. A voice called out her name, sometimes Nina, sometimes Amara, sometimes something else. She was caught in a loop, shifting between memories that weren't hers, but felt painfully real. A conversation she didn't remember having, a laughter that echoed from nowhere, a loss so raw it made her knees buckle, and then the room collapsed into darkness. She fell into the void, a silence so deep it pressed against her eardrums. Time fractured, folding in on itself like broken glass. She saw flashes, faces, places, moments overlapping, impossible to untangle. When the darkness finally lifted, she was back in the apartment. The photographs were gone. The whispering had ceased, but in her hand, she held a new photograph, one of her, smiling. Only her eyes were empty, hollow voids staring back at her. The walls around her seemed to lean closer, and a voice, barely audible, breathed into the silence. You are all and none. You remember what cannot be forgotten, and soon you will be forgotten too. Amara dropped the photo. It shattered like glass. The apartment exhaled, and the whispering began again. Chapter 10. Shadows of the Forgotten. The morning light was hesitant, struggling through thick curtains of cloud, casting a pallid glow over the remnants of the night's torment. Amara sat on the edge of her bed, the weight of the photographs, shattered shards pressing into the fabric of her jeans, cold and sharp. Her mind reeled from the visions, the whispers, and the impossible reflections of lives she hadn't lived, but somehow remembered. She traced a finger along the edge of the broken photo, feeling the sting of emptiness behind those hollow eyes. A part of her wanted to scream, to shake off the creeping madness that tethered her to the apartment's dark heartbeat. But deep inside, she knew the walls weren't just stones and plaster. They were memories incarnate, and she was a prisoner of their tangled stories. The book, her constant companion, rested on the bedside table, pages fluttering open to new entries that she hadn't written. The ink bled slowly, staining the parchment with tailies that twisted her reality further. Names multiplied, memories overlapped, and the line between who she was and who she had been blurred into oblivion. Driven by a restless need to find answers, Amara stepped out into the corridor. The air was thick, oppressive, as if the building itself breathed in sync with her shallow breaths. The whispering walls resumed their chant, soft at first, then rising in a crescendo of voices overlapping in mournful harmony. She passed door after door, some familiar, others foreign, until she reached the staircase, spiraling downward into the building's bowels. The basement had always been off limits, sealed by rusted gates and forgotten locks. But tonight, a faint light flickered beneath the door, casting long, dancing shadows onto the cracked tiles. Amara's heart hammered in her chest. She pushed open the gate with a groan of protest and descended into the darkness. The basement was a labyrinth of cold stone corridors, lined with shelves upon shelves of dusty tomes and forgotten artifacts. The scent of old paper and damp earth mingled with the faint metallic tang of something far darker. At the center of the labyrinth stood a pedestal, upon which rested a single, leather-bound book, unlike any she had seen. Its cover was unmarked, but it radiated a presence that tugged at her very soul. Her fingers trembled as she opened the book. The pages were blank at first. Then words began to form, ink spreading across the surface like living shadows. To find oneself, one must first lose all names. The whispers swelled around her, voices she had come to know and fear. They spoke in riddles, fragments of forgotten conversations and half-remembered dreams. Amara felt the weight of countless lives pressing down upon her, each demanding to be heard, to be remembered. Suddenly, the walls seemed to dissolve, replaced by a void filled with flickering images, faces, places, moments suspended in time. She saw herself as Elias, standing beneath a blood-red sky, as Cora, writing frantic notes in a dimly lit room, as Myra, singing lullabies to shadows, as Elen, baking bread that never quite rose. The multiplicity of her existence crashed down like a wave, threatening to drown her in a sea of fragmented memories. Then a voice soft, yet commanding, broke through the chaos. "Amara," it whispered, "you are more than the sum of your names. You are the story that binds them all." She reached out, trying to grasp the voice, but it slipped through her fingers like smoke. As the void collapsed, Amara found herself back in the basement. The book closed before her, but the words lingered, etched into her mind like a mantra. Rising from the pedestal, she knew that to reclaim herself, she would have to confront the shadows of the forgotten, the lives that had been lost, erased, or overwritten. Her journey was far from over, and the building, with its whispering walls and shifting memories, was waiting. Chapter 11. The Ink That Remembers. Amara woke to the sound of rustling pages. The book again. Not hers, not the ash-bound one with its familiar scent and unsettling ink, but another. A second book had appeared at her bedside, its cover slick with something that looked like oil, its pages already half-filled with an elegant, alien script that bled between lines like watercolors bleeding on damp paper. She hadn't opened it. It opened itself. Outside her window, the sky churned a deep bruised purple, with veins of silver slicing across the clouds like cracks in a mirror. The village no longer seemed to sleep or wake. It existed in a liminal hush, neither dreaming nor aware. People drifted like puppets cut from strings, and none spoke names anymore. Names had weight now. Names could change the air, bend time. Saying a name was like lighting a match in a room soaked in kerosene. The baker's wife had said Myra aloud 2 days ago. Her house burned to the ground that night, flames with no source. No sound, just silent tongues of smoke curling upward, swallowing the roof like a sigh. She survived, but she never spoke again. Amara dressed carefully, layering her clothes like armor. The new book went into her satchel, wrapped in an old scarf she didn't remember owning. The ash-bound journal remained clutched in her hand like a relic. She stepped into the street. The flowers had spread again, winding around doorways, over rooftops, growing in symmetrical lines, along the main road like ink trails, leading somewhere she wasn't sure she wanted to go. They whispered when touched. She had tried once, grazing a fingertip against one of the listening blooms. For a second, she remembered everything, every version, every life, every death. She collapsed in the square, screaming. When she woke, the sun hadn't moved. Neither had the people. A girl named Aya helped her up, though Amara hadn't seen her in weeks. She didn't speak, only handed her a dried flower shaped like an ear. She still had it, pressed into the back pages of the ash book. Today, the trail of flowers led toward the old watchtower. The village's edges were fraying. She noticed it in small ways, windows that looked into different rooms every day, clocks that ticked backward, children who aged in reverse. And now, the buildings at the farthest boundary had started fading, not crumbling, not rotting, just blurring, as if reality itself was being erased, line by line, word by word. She reached the watchtower by midday. The doors were ajar, creaking with each breath of the wind. Inside, everything was as she remembered, stone steps curling upward, iron lanterns hanging from rusted hooks, and a table littered with books and maps. Elias had left his mark here. She felt it, like a handprint on warm skin. The scent of tobacco and old parchment lingered. One of the journals on the desk bore his name. She opened it carefully. The pages were filled with diagrams, timelines, sketches of mirrors and doors and bleeding staircases. Notes scrawled in urgent ink. The fracture point moves every time we name it. Cora remembers the red corridor. Avoid the red corridor. Nina might be the source, or the first echo. We are not meant to resolve. We are meant to repeat. Amara closed the book and pressed her forehead to the desk. Elias, she whispered, not sure if she meant it as a plea, a memory, or a curse. The tower groaned. Footsteps echoed above. She climbed the stairs. The higher she went, the darker it became. The lanterns should have offered light, but their flames danced without illumination, casting shadows without source. At the top, the room was empty, except for a mirror. It had not been there before. It showed not her reflection, but a hallway. Long, narrow, pulsing like a throat. Doors lined its sides, each slightly ajar, and faint music played from somewhere deep within. A violin. She reached out, touched the mirror. It opened. The hallway swallowed her. No transition. No fanfare. One moment, she stood before the mirror. The next, she walked upon soft crimson carpet, walls breathing beside her, each door humming with sound and memory. She passed them slowly. Behind one door, a woman crying into a wedding dress. A child screamed from a crib. Behind another, snow falling upward, burying a man reading a book written in screams. The next, a classroom filled with faceless students repeating a single phrase in unison. I am the unwritten. Amara pressed onward. At the end of the corridor stood a door painted with her names. All of them. Elen, Myra, Cora, Aya, Nina. Names she hadn't even heard yet. It pulsed. She opened it. A library, but unlike the one from before, this one floated in darkness. The shelves spiraled upward, infinitely tall, vanishing into blackness. The books here were bound in flesh, in hair, in old wallpaper. Some whispered, some bled. The center held a table, one chair. She sat. Across from her sat another Amara, older, tired, eyes like deep ink wells. You came far, the other said. I had to. You didn't, most don't, most repeat. I remember them all. No, you remember enough to think you do. The older Amara held up a hand. 12 small mirrors hovered above her palm, each reflecting a different version. You're the 13th, the author, the archivist, the anomaly. What happens now? You finish the story. The ink-bound book appeared on the table. Her pen lay beside it. A single page remained blank. She reached for the pen. The older Amara smiled. Careful. Endings are just beginnings that believe too hard. Amara nodded, wrote one word. Then everything folded. The village, the names, the corridors, the mirrors, all collapsed into a single dot of ink, and the ink became her. She awoke in her bed. The books were gone. The flowers were gone, but the whispers remained. Only now they spoke with her voice. She smiled, and began to write again, not to fix the story, but to remember it, to remember them, to remember herself. The ink would carry her, as it always had, and this time the story would not forget. Chapter 12. The Archive Beneath the Roots. Amara stood in the village square, where the cobblestones no longer matched the rhythm of her steps. The air was thick with a soundless echo, a pressure that built without sound or motion. Above her, the sky was still split by those silver-veined bruises in the clouds, but now the clouds spiraled slowly, drawing everything inward. The village seemed suspended mid-thought, waiting for the next sentence to be written. She followed the path of the ink flowers, now wider, more defined, forming twin lines that slithered like veins down a street she did not remember existing. No one followed her, or perhaps no one could. Each villager she passed wore a face like a closed book, pages sealed with wax, no eyes behind their eyes. She knew now that they were echoes, stories that once lived, bound, and looped again. Lives copied too many times until the ink bled through the paper. Not false, just softened by repetition. The ink flowers guided her beyond the blurred boundary of the village, where houses became outlines and trees were painted shadows. There, at the forest's edge, the flowers thickened into vines, winding down into a slope she hadn't known existed. A root-covered hill parted like a curtain as she stepped closer. Earth folded away, revealing a staircase spiraling into darkness, lit only by the slow pulse of glowing petals. She descended, each step feeling like a page turned in reverse. At the base, a vast chamber opened like a lung. It was silent, except for the low rustling of turning pages, millions of them, echoing like the wind through a paper forest. The archive. It wasn't just a library. It was alive. Trees of books stretched upward without end, their trunks wrapped in vines of ink. The roots spread across the floor, interwoven with desks, lamps, and broken timepieces. Words fluttered in the air like fireflies, phrases without authors, drifting freely until they found a home. A woman waited there. Not Amara. Not exactly. A figure cloaked in layers of translucent parchment, her face a shifting pattern of names. One moment it looked like Aya, the next like Myra, then Cora, and then unfamiliar names that scratched at the edges of Amara's memory. "You're late," the woman said. Amara didn't answer. She walked forward, gripping her book tighter. "You remember too much," the woman continued, circling. "That's dangerous. Memory is just another kind of ink. Too much of it, and you drown." Amara glanced at the shelves. Some books wept ink from their spines. Others glowed faintly, like lanterns left to burn too long. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you started writing," the figure replied. "That's all it takes. One line, one word, one name. That's authorship. And authors must choose. Choose what?" The woman pointed to a massive tome in the center of the chamber, bound in wood and sealed with metal clasps. The root book. It holds the first name, the one that started the fracture. Read it, and you can end this, or become it. Amara stepped closer. The book trembled. Its clasps clicked open as she reached it, each movement slow and deliberate, as though time had to be persuaded. She opened the cover. No text, only a mirror. Her reflection stared back. But it wasn't just her. It was every version of her layered like inked transparencies. Myra's sorrow, Aya's fire, Cora's calm fury, Elias' logic, Nina's fragile hope. Even names she had never claimed shimmered in and out. Then the mirror cracked. A word appeared. It wasn't in any language she knew, yet she understood it. Her name, the first name. She gasped. The archive shuddered. Shelves split. Trees groaned. Pages erupted from the floor like flocks of birds. The figure of names screamed not in pain, but in laughter. Amara held the book to her chest. Not the root book, it had vanished, but her own. The ash-bound journal. Its pages now glowed with burning lines, words written in real fire. She turned and fled the collapsing archive. The stairs reformed ahead of her, lifting and twisting like vertebrae. She didn't know how she made it out. The village was gone, not destroyed, not burned, just archived, folded. A paper town tucked into a story's final page. She stood alone on blank earth. The sky was clean, the ink trails gone, but her book still whispered, and she still remembered. She turned the last page. It was blank. She wrote, "I remember," and the world began again. Chapter 13, Final Echo. The page did not simply accept her words, it consumed them. The moment Amara wrote, "I remember," the ink sank into the fibers like blood, finding its way back into a still heart. The book warmed in her hands, not in temperature, but in sensation, as if acknowledging her act with a pulse of recognition. Around her, the blank earth trembled slightly, like a beast stirring beneath a thin crust of silence. There was no more village, no more paths of ink flowers or distorted townsfolk. Only the wind, which seemed to speak in sighs rather than gusts, and the sky clean, vast, and watchful. The archive was buried now, sealed under layers of memory and soil, unreachable to any but those who already carried its echo. Amara, now fully herself, and yet made of many, felt the weight of all her names settle within her like roots finally intertwining. Myra, who had screamed truth into voids. Aya, who had burned bridges and buried mirrors. Cora, whose silence had held strength like stone. Elias, logic wrapped in fear. Nina, always searching, always forgetting. They had never been separate, just scattered reflections in a hallway with too many doors. And now she had them all. The book in her hands was no longer ashbound. It had transformed. Its cover was now something like bark and bone, and when she opened it again, the pages rearranged themselves into a map. Not of places, but of patterns, wound shapes, cycles, a chart of choices, echoing every moment she had turned left instead of right, whispered instead of shouted, remembered instead of forgetting. It was a map of the fractures. The space she stood in, while empty, was not barren. It was waiting. And as the ground responded to her presence, lines began to emerge, faint at first, but growing thicker with every heartbeat. Symbols, glyphs, tracks of an ancient language that looked like it had been left behind by a dreaming god. These weren't markings of territory. They were the foundation of memory, of identity. The map in her book synced with the ground's awakening. Somewhere far ahead, the wind took shape. It twisted, then nodded, and from it formed a figure. Not the shrouded woman of names from the archive, but a child. A girl, ink-streaked and barefoot, hair wild with dried leaves. Her eyes were mirrors, silver pools where 1,000 stories flickered, unread but waiting. She said nothing. She simply extended her hand. Amara approached, wary but drawn. The closer she got, the more familiar the girl became. Not in her features, but in her posture, the way she tilted her head, the exact way Amara had stood at the edge of the archive's stairwell. Unsure but compelled, the girl did not speak. Instead, she held out a thin object wrapped in black twine. It was a pen. No, not quite. It was a quill, but made not from feather, but from the branch of the archive trees. Its point shimmered with heat, not ink, and it pulsed faintly in rhythm with Amara's breath. When she took it, the earth shifted again. This time, a door grew from the soil. Not emerged, grew. It stretched upward, unfurling from the ground like a plant that had waited too long to bloom. Red wood, iron handle, marked with sigils that Amara had seen carved into the rootbook's base. This was the true door, not to the village, not to the archive, to the beginning. The girl with mirrored eyes stood beside it now, waiting, still silent, still watchful. Amara knew the moment she passed through, something would end, or begin, or both. But there was no fear in her anymore. Just the presence of every version of herself that had survived, that had fought, that had remembered. She placed the book against her chest and stepped forward. The door creaked open with a sigh like old pages turning. Inside was not darkness. Inside was a room, familiar, too familiar. A desk cluttered with papers. A single rain-streaked window. Walls lined with books she had never finished, but always meant to. A mirror. A flickering lamp. Her room, back at the beginning, before the archive, before the dream of the village, before even the whispers. But this time, everything shimmered slightly. The mirror no longer reflected the physical, it showed layers. Amara approached it and saw them all. Nina, Cora, Aya, Elias, Myra. Even names she had never worn in any reality. All stacked like transparencies, breathing in tandem. The quill in her hand grew warm. On the desk, a journal lay open, blank, waiting. She sat. Outside the window, the rain began again, not the kind that wept, but the kind that washed. She placed the quill on the page and began to write, not to escape, not to survive, but to continue, because stories didn't end. They changed shapes. They echoed. They waited in the roots, in the walls, in the names we forget. She wrote, "This is how the story ends, and this is how it always begins." Then she closed the book, and her room, breathed with her. Soft, steady, remembered. Above, deep in the soil, where ink flowers once bloomed, a new archive seed pulsed. It would not bloom today, but one day, when the names slept long enough, it would whisper, and a new story would begin. Epilogue, the roots that remember. The rain fell softly. A lullaby whispered across the skin of the earth. Not the storming, surging kind that drowned voices, but the sort of rain that made you think of forgotten lullabies and lost names. It soaked into the soil above the buried archive, where the village once stood, where paths of ink flowers once twisted like veins through time. The land was still now, but not empty. It dreamed, and in that dreaming soil, the roots remembered. Far below, the archive had quieted. The great book trees stood dormant, their pages still, and their words tucked between covers like sleeping birds in nests. But memory never truly sleeps. It lingers in the marrow of things, coiled tight as seeds beneath frost. Even now, after the collapse, the archive pulsed faintly. Not with fear, not with sorrow, with waiting. Amara had gone. Or perhaps she had finally arrived. Whatever she had become, whoever she had become, was no longer traceable through simple narrative. The archive did not hold her as a single name anymore. It had released her into the wild spine of the world, into the curled edge of every book, the margin of every story where things could be rewritten. In a far-off town, years and names away, a child sat by a window during a thunderstorm. Her fingers were stained with ink she didn't remember touching. The journal before her was old, its cover warped by time, but it hummed gently under her palms. She didn't know where it came from, only that it felt like it had been waiting for her, like a story picking its reader instead of the other way around. She opened it, blank pages, but her fingers itched. She picked up a pen, a strange one, bark-colored and warm to the touch. It shimmered faintly, like it had been cut from lightning and memory. And then she wrote her name. No guides, no rituals, just one name. And the room around her rippled. The storm outside paused. Not stopped, just hesitated, like the world itself was listening. And as she wrote, the ink on the page writhed slightly, alive with something deeper than language. Far beneath her house, deeper than basements and buried pipes, something stirred. A strand of root uncoiled in the dark, ancient and new all at once. It reached up. It remembered. The archive, though collapsed in form, was not destroyed. It had simply taken seed, spread across the world now, scattered into stories, left dormant in abandoned houses, stitched between lines of forgotten diaries. waiting beneath the beds of restless dreamers. It existed wherever names were spoken without meaning, wherever echoes felt too sharp, too real, where dreams didn't fade completely after waking. The ink flowers would bloom again, not in one place, but many, each carrying the potential for fracture, each a mirror, because the archive had never been about preserving stories. It was about choice. Every person who touched a name made a decision to remember, to forget, to become. And some, like Amara, chose to continue. Back in the child's room, the window pane rattled. The journal trembled. Her name glowed. And she smiled. She didn't know the full story. Not yet, but it was hers now. Somewhere behind her, unseen, a figure stood, draped in pages, face unreadable, its presence light as breath. Watching, waiting, not to interfere, only to witness. Every archive needs its readers, and every name once spoken calls out again. This was not an ending, just another echo. The roots remembered, and the rain kept falling.